So my name is Evgeny Matveyev. I'm the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the Elk River Alliance. And today I'll be talking to you about flooding in the Elk Valley, some of the risks of flooding in the valley, and some of the mitigation measures that we can implement in order to mitigate those risks. So let's start with a history of flooding in the valley. So let's wind the clock back 11,000 years ago. This entire area, and in fact most of Canada, was covered by ice. It was covered by two ice sheets, the Laurentine ice sheet and the Cordilleran ice sheet. And as the ice melted and retreated, in the valley it left behind this glacial Lake Elk, which filled pretty much the entirety of the valley and was blocked off at the south end by something, but probably by another ice sheet in the Rocky Mountain Trench over here. And the outflow was through the Crow's Nest Pass, and it flowed out east. The water flowed out east that way. Then a dam broke through, and it hit up against another ice dam here, and the water was flowing out through here, through Silver Spring Lakes, where some of you have probably been. And then the water flowed through into the Wigwam, and then started flowing out west. And then finally, that dam broke through again, and then water flowed through where it does now. So it's kind of a fun little factoid that Silver Spring Lakes is a remnant of this, where the river used to flow. So the Ktunaxa have been here for about 10,000 years, it's estimated. And it's important to remember that we are on the land that has been stewarded by the Ktunaxa for thousands of years now. But they never really settled in the valley. They primarily just traveled through the valley on their way to the bison hunt in Alberta. And the reason that they haven't settled here, it's thought to be, is that this valley is prone to wildfires and to flooding. So flooding has a long history in this valley. Of course, when colonizers came, they were not deterred by the flooding and built right on the floodplain. And so you've had, ever since records began, we've had flooding in the valley. And you can see these are some of the historic floods that we've had. This is a picture from the 1916 flood, and I believe this is the West Fernie Bridge. And you can kind of see all of this is, the water level is high, it's all flooded out. This was one of the worst floods on record. And something you'll notice is that most of these floods are happening in June, May, and except for this one in January, which is an outlier. But just kind of notice the dates of those floods, because that'll be important later. And the floods happen at about a 10 to 20 year interval. More recently, and in some people's memories here perhaps, is the 1995 flood, again on June 7th. And it's hard to see on this picture, but this is an excavator that is completely covered in water. So, ironically, this excavator was working on dike renovations. From this picture, it's obvious to see that that floods cause damage to property, they cause damage to human safety, to equipment and infrastructure. Even more recently, in 2013, probably in a lot of people's memories here, is the 2013 flood. This is the worst flood that has happened in the valley since that 1916 one that I showed you earlier. Again, on June 21st, and this is Hosmer, and it's all flooded out. And you can see that the water is covering a bunch of people's property, and this caused a lot of stress to a lot of people who lived here at the time. Even more recently, just 2 years ago, there was the 2021, not exactly flood, but the high water event that we remember. A lot of British Columbia was flooded, but we just had some of our creeks and some of our water levels were super high, and it blew out some areas in town. This is Coal Creek Road. Coal Creek Road was blown out and eroded away by Coal Creek. And this is the gun range. And you can see that the creek eroded all the area right up to the gun range, causing some infrastructure damage to the actual range. So all of this is to say that floods are nothing new in the valley. They have been happening time and time again. And because we live in the floodplain, we have to be prepared and we have to deal with them. And we have to plan ahead for flooding to happen repeatedly. So what causes flooding? I mean, on the surface of it, it's an obvious question, water. But why do we have repeated flooding in this valley? So that is impossible to see. But this is just a picture of the valley. You have mountains on either end. And as you have snowmelt and precipitation that falls on these mountains, you have water that flows from either end and then aggregates down at the bottom, forming the Elk River. And then when water rises above the banks of the Elk River, that's when you have flooding. As you may remember from those historical photos, flooding happens in this May, June, July period. And the reason for that is because this is when we have coinciding snowmelt coinciding with high precipitation. So this May, June period is when we have the highest precipitation. This is the graph of precipitation throughout Fernie. And you can see the rain in dark blue and snow in light blue. And you can see that as the temperatures heat up, this snowpack that's built up over the winter starts melting right as when we have a period of highest precipitation. So this is when all of the floods are happening. And if we look at a hydrograph, just a graph that shows the water level in a river, this is from a station right outside of the annex, you can see that this is when the river is highest during this period of freshet. And this is how the river looks at the time. It's brown, it's murky, there's a bunch of woody debris in it, it's moving fast. This little peak here is the 2013 flood. Again, you can see that this is the period when you had this coinciding period of snowmelt and high precipitation. In 2021, this little blip here is that event, and that was the atmospheric river event. So an atmospheric river is just a bunch of water vapor that is moving through the ocean, and as it hits land, it starts to precipitate out. So by the time it got to us, most of it had already been precipitated out. But as we all remember, a bunch of BC got flooded during that time. So this is something that's going to happen more and more with climate change. So let's look at some factors that humans can influence and do influence to make flood damage worse. So I'm going to talk, flood damage is a factor of two things. It's a factor of the amount of water and the water speed. So you can have a low amount of water, but if it's moving really quickly, such as during a flash flood, it can cause a huge ton of damage. Similarly, you can have a bunch of slow-moving water, but if the water levels are really high, it's going to cause a lot of damage. So it's something to remember when I talk about these things that we do that cause flood damage, or that impact flood damage. So I'm going to be talking about four main categories. I'll talk about building on a floodplain. I'll talk about stream channelization, vegetation removal, and then finally I'll just touch on climate change. So let's talk about building on a floodplain. This is a map that was released by the Elk River Alliance in the Elk River Flood Strategy Report in 2016 in response to the 2013 flood. This is a report that you can find on our website, elkriveralliance.ca. If you go to information, I believe, it goes under flooding. This is a long report. It has a lot of information in it, a lot of it really pertinent to flooding in the Elk Valley, why it happens, and the damage that it causes. This map here shows two things. It shows the flood hazard in pink and the floodplain in green. Floodplain is just where flooding is likely to happen, and flood hazard is where it's likely to cause significant damage. And this graph here, or this picture here, shows a simulation of the 2013 flood. And it basically shows where the flood waters were. It's just kind of a fun, interesting thing to look at. Especially if you live in town, you can see, is my property in the floodplain or in the flood hazard zone, and what happened in 2013. That's an essential thing to being prepared, is knowing whether you are in flood hazard territory. So let's talk about channelization. So a natural river, it meanders back and forth. It creates little back channels. It creates little wetlands on its side. It has braids, but it takes up quite a bit of space, and over time it goes back and forth, and that's a little bit unpredictable. Humans don't like that. So sometimes what we do is we channelize a river. And that means just stabilizing each end of the river to make it go exactly where we want it to go. And it's never this kind of meander, it's just a straight line. So here is an example of all the kinds of different types of habitats, different kinds of shapes that you can have in a river. This is the Elk River just upstream of Sparwood. And here you can see beautiful wetlands over here. You can see little back channels where the river used to go but doesn't anymore, but this is just still a wet area. And this creates incredible habitat diversity for a bunch of animals like beavers, like fish, like birds, like mammals. So this kind of stream diversity is actually really important ecologically. Additionally, it can help with flood mitigation because if you look at this picture from 2013, taken just days after the 2013 flood, what you'll see is that these wetlands are full of water. These back channels are full of water. And if that water is in these back channels and in these wetlands, it's not causing damage downstream. So it's reducing the amount of water that's downstream and the speed of water that's downstream. In contrast, you have this picture of the Okanagan River in Osoyoos. Osoyoos? Osoyoos. Yeah, all right, cool. And you can see where the river used to go, right? You can see these little meanders back and forth and back and forth. These are essentially scars of days gone by, because this is where the river actually goes now. This straight down channel that's being reinforced on either end to make sure it doesn't meander into these farmers' fields and damage their property. This is what it looks like from a bridge. Straight down the middle, and you can see reinforcements of riprap on either end. No habitat diversity. Additionally, this sort of channelization increases the speed of floods. So if you think about it, these meanders increase the length of the stream. And so that decreases the slope of the actual, of the water, like of the path of the water, the way of the water, right? So it's kind of like when you're hiking and you don't want to go straight up a mountain, and so you go zigzag, zigzag to decrease the amount of incline that you're encountering. If you channelize the river, you're increasing the slope and the water starts going real fast. And that might not be a problem for this specific area, because if you don't have overflow, that's not flood damage. However, anything that's downstream here is going to get hit with a lot of really fast moving water. So channelization not only decreases animal habitat, but it also increases flood impacts downstream. So essentially you're just pushing your flood somewhere else, and it's somebody else's problem. Now the Elk River so far is by and large fairly natural, not super channelized, but the more we develop, the more channelization we have. So this is just downstream of Fernie. You have Highway 3 and the railroad over here. What you can see is as the river is trying to meander into this area over here, it can't because the highway has been reinforced to protect this infrastructure. And then it bounces back up, and then same thing again happening with the railroad over here. So it's important to consider when planning future infrastructure that we want to keep this natural meander of rivers going. All right, let's move on to vegetation removal. So streamside vegetation, or riparian vegetation, has a lot of benefits to the ecosystem because it provides a lot of habitat, etc., but it also helps in abating flood impacts. So first of all, tree trunks and shrubs, they slow down floodwaters by creating resistance for water. So imagine you have water overflowing over a bank, and it starts hitting up against all these shrubs, all these trees. It slows down. It has time to get absorbed into the soil. Or it has time to return back into the stream. Whereas if you don't have these trees, you have those floodwaters rush across a field, and again, you have faster moving waters that go further and to cause more damage. Additionally, tree roots hold soil in place and they prevent erosion. They act essentially like rebar, holding onto the ground and making sure that it doesn't get eroded away. And if you remove that, you start getting erosion around areas where you've removed the trees. So here's an example of this. This is a farmer's field. that is right outside of Sparwood. And you can see that this is the area that it was back in 2004. This is, I believe, when it was active. Then, just a few days after the flood in 2013, you see that a huge chunk of it has been wiped away. And then currently, about a quarter, I would say, of this property is now gone. So this is likely because there was absolutely no vegetation protecting this little area, which is exposed to high-speed waters. There was no protection, and it just got, washed away. So leaving a strip of vegetation is really important. Here's another example. This is in an area between Sparwood and Fernie. You can see that this is the river bend in 2009, and in 2013, when the flood came through, you have almost everything washed away, except for this little band of trees. So that really illustrates how powerful these roots can be in protecting, the soil, and protecting the ground from erosion. Not only that, but these trees are likely serving as a buffer, preventing further damage downstream to this bank over here. So the water probably slowed down over here and then went around rather than slamming into this area right there. But not only streamside vegetation impacts floodwaters. Can't see that at all, but this is a picture of basically a clear cut. We all know what it looks like. If you drive into the highway or into Fernie, there's clear cuts everywhere on the sides of the mountains. We all know that. And if you remove all these trees, you prevent them from casting shade on the snow. So in the springtime, like around now-ish, you have a much higher direct exposure of snow to sunlight, and so that it starts melting a lot faster, and that increases these peak freshet flows. So again, if we remember when floods happen here, happens during freshet. If those peak freshet flows are increased and they coincide with precipitation, bad news bears. And this is an image that outlines, this is Fernie right here. All of this orange outline is forest that has been lost since 2014 in our area. So it's considerable. There's a lot of it. This is a lot of private land logging. Yeah, I hear some boos from the back. I will abstain from making personal judgment calls, but I agree. So obviously this will have some impacts on places like Coal Creek, which is right here, and places like this creek, Michelle? Is this Michelle? I don't know. Yeah, so obviously this likely has some impacts downstream waters. Urban centers also have impacts on floodwaters in terms of riparian vegetation removal. So by removing, basically paving over vegetated areas, you cut off the water from being infiltrated into the ground. So normally, if you have rainfall, it gets soaked into the soil and then into the groundwater. But if you pave that area over, that doesn't happen. It accumulates, flows faster over top of over roads, and then it causes more flood damage because it's fast, high-level water. All of the flood stuff notwithstanding, riparian vegetation and vegetation in general has really great benefits for the ecosystem. So not only does it provide biological matter inputs, so leaves and twigs that decompose feed bacteria, which feed small insects, which feed fish, etc. But trees cast shade, which can decrease stream temperatures by up to 5 degrees. Trees falling into the water can provide habitat for fish. And forests in general provide habitat for animals like bears and elk, etc. So it's important to keep our riparian vegetation alive for those reasons. And finally, climate change. Climate change is an overarching umbrella over all of this, but more specifically, under climate change, we're expected to see more extreme weather events and more extreme precipitation, as well as faster snowmelt because of more extreme heat events. So again, in this area, pretty much all of our flooding happens because of precipitation and snowmelt, so we're expected to see a lot more floods in the valley, so we should get used to it. So how do we mitigate flood damage? So there's three categories that I'd like to talk to you about. First of all, planning, building flood protection structures, and increasing upstream flood sequestration. So let's start with the most obvious one, planning. I'm not going to dwell on this. Don't build on a floodplain. If you build on a floodplain, your structure, your infrastructure is going to get flooded out, and there's two things that are going to happen. Either you're going to have to move, or you're going to have to build something to protect yourself from those floods. And that increases stream channelization, and basically, that's not the way to go. The way to go is to make sure you build wherever floods don't happen. In some cases, it's too late. So in Fernie, we've already established here, I'm not asking anybody to pick up Fernie and move it somewhere else. So there are ways that municipalities can protect us from flooding. So one of the constructions that we can build is dikes. So this is the annex dike. We recently got a bit of a facelift. This is an effective protection of property measure. It's fairly fast and relatively easy to build. However, it is expensive. It does degrade the animal habitat, and ultimately it channelizes the stream, which just pushes the flooding downstream. So we're saying, this is not our problem, it's a problem for somebody else. Similarly, riprap, which is just a bunch of boulders or rocks or synthetic material that are lined at the banks to prevent erosion. It's effective, it's pretty fast, but it is expensive, and it completely destroys the habitat of the area around the stream. So not ideal. Additionally, once again, it channelizes the stream, pushing the problem further downstream. Pints. Cheers. Vegetated riprap is a bit of an in-between. It's a bit of a more eco-friendly way to do riprap. Essentially the same thing, but you plant plants, you intersperse plants within the riprap. It's effective. It helps with slowing down floodwaters. There is some recovery of habitat, but once again, it results in stream channelization. Somebody else's problem. We have two retention ponds in Fernie. We have Maiden Lake and we have Annex Pond. These do help with helping with floods. They do take up some of the water during flooding. Additionally, it cleans stormwater. They clean stormwater by letting pollutants settle out. The water spends some time there before it returns to the river. It provides animal habitat. It's quite beautiful. However, it does provide limited flood protection, and it takes up a lot of space. Finally, we can make sure that upstream areas sequester a bunch of our flood damage. So that means leaving our wetlands intact, leaving our back channels intact, and leaving the meander of the river. And one thing that we can do to help with that is riparian area revegetation. So this is the SKC farm, now known as the Morrissey Meadows Nature Conservancy of Canada Conservation Area. This is secondary students that we've had help plant understory species in this area to kind of help bring back that riparian vegetation and help with reestablishing a natural habitat for animals. This is the area from above. It used to be a farmer's field. And you can see that eventually it would probably all get washed out. So we're trying to build out this area right here to make sure that there is a protective barrier of vegetation. So this provides aquatic and terrestrial habitat. It's relatively cheap. They didn't get paid. It's long-term. It decreases downstream impacts. It helps with property protection because now that farmer's field is actually still intact, or it will be intact, but it does take time. So this kind of work can take decades to actually take an effect, because trees take time to grow. Additionally, this isn't a solution to flooding in an urban area. This is just making sure that downstream you have slower floodwaters, and it's and less sediment being washed in the river, less erosion, etc. So with that, I would like to bring up the Elk River Alliance Cottonwood Survey and Restoration Project. So cottonwood trees, we know them, we might love them. They are these beautiful deciduous trees that turn this orange shade in the winter. They love to grow in riparian areas around the floodplain. They have these white fluffy seeds in the spring that make it look like it's snowing, in the summer. And they are some of the first plants to establish after any sort of flood damage. So if you have a gravel bed that is, from a receding river, you'll probably see saplings of cottonwood trees establishing not long after grass. And so you have these seedlings start to grow into mature stands, and then eventually you have a mature deciduous forest growing after that. So the project is basically trying to help in this, kind of push this initial stage forward in areas that are being impacted by human activity. So currently, about 10% of the Elk River floodplain is covered in cottonwood, and our aim is to increase that number. And you can see, no, you can't see, but you can imagine that around some of the river areas, you have a lot of forest loss. So we're just trying to kind of combat that. So there's two components. The first component of this project is the Cottonwood Survey. That's funded by the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program. So the first step is to establish where most of the cottonwood loss happened, then determine where restoration is needed, and finally reach out to landowners about restoration potential on their property, because about 76% of restoration potential areas are on private land. And we don't want to go in there and just tell landowners what to do. We want to work with them to ensure that their needs are being met as well as restoration needs. So if there's a farm field, for example, we would do a custom prescription for that area to tell them where we would plant the plants in order to protect their property, as well as help with the restoring habitat and decreasing flood intensity, etc. Finally, and the next stage of this project would be cottonwood restoration, and that's funded by the Columbia Basin Trust, and that would be planting thousands of cottonwood trees in restoration areas, fencing off some of those sections for elk exclusion so that all those trees that we just planted don't get grazed by elk right away. This was also served as an experiment to see the efficacy of elk exclusion fencing. And then finally planting understory plants to enhance habitat. So plants like Saskatoon berries, like thimbleberries, like things we see in natural areas growing already to enhance this habitat for mammals and fish. So there's three major benefits to this project. One is flood resilience improvement, aquatic habitat improvement, and terrestrial habitat improvement. Now this work is going to take a lot of work. And we will need volunteers. So we'll need volunteers to dedicate their time to planting cottonwood live stakes along riparian areas. So this is, now that you've all signed the volunteer sheet, presumably, you're on the hook. So come on out, help us. If you have any questions about this project, please let us know. If you have any concerns, if you're a landowner and you want your property to be considered for restoration, please talk to us. We really need that, and want to help you. With that, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank our funders, the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program and the Columbia Basin Trust. And me and Chad will take any questions you might have about this project, flooding in general, and any questions you might have. Thank you.